Hi, I'm Yulia, and this is the News Brief. And today we're going to be talking about Steve Witkoff's scandalous interview with Tucker Carlson, where he showed himself as incompetent and frankly proved why it is that Putin wants him on the negotiations, not someone else. And of course, as per usual, we're going to be discussing this in the comments, so you don't have to suffer alone, and I don't have to suffer alone. So please don't hesitate to leave your questions, suggestions, opinions, constructive criticism, anything in your mind, because I love to have a conversation. Let's go. So, as a lot of you might have seen, Tucker Carlson recently interviewed Steve Witkoff, who is the special envoy for the Ukraine and Russia conflict resolution.
Putin's got a huge respect for the president. And, you saw what happened in the Oval Office with Zelensky and the president, right?
Yes.
Disrespecting him is not a healthy way to have a good relationship.
The arrogance of small countries, it's like, get some perspective. I mean, come on. How can you imagine acting like that?
And they're dependent on us.
Oh, I know.
And we've been so good to them.
I know.
And I think but look, that's been corrected, and that's a really good thing. It got corrected, and
yes.
Hopefully we'll chalk it up to a misunderstanding, and we'll get to a peace solution here. That we're going to want everybody to be, in some respect, satisfied. So we're going to want the Russians to be satisfied in some respect. We're going to want the Ukrainians to be satisfied in some respect. We're talking to the Europeans. When I say satisfied, feeling that we came out of this thing, okay, with a deal that everybody can live with. I think that we have moved Russia in ways that no one thought was possible. So in the last conversation, they agreed to an energy infrastructure ceasefire, which means Russia is not going to target Ukraine's energy infrastructure, and Ukraine will not target Russia's energy infrastructure. They've never talked about that before. Here we are talking about that. They've never talked about reinstituting the Black Sea moratorium on maritime hits. Ukraine firing on Russian ships, Russia firing on Ukrainian ships. Now we're down to, and that's going to be implemented over the next week or so. There's some details that need to be discussed, but that became a part of that conversation. That's big stuff, really big stuff. What's the ultimate goal? The ultimate goal is a 30-day ceasefire, during which time we discuss a permanent ceasefire. We're not far away from that, but a 30-day ceasefire is something where we have to figure out what all the battlefield conditions are, which is why I began with Kursk. But Kursk is just the beginning of it, because there's this 2,000-kilometer, that's 1,200 miles, this 2,000-kilometer border between Ukraine and Russia, where the Russian and Ukrainian troops are involved in, 50, 60, 70, maybe 80 firefights throughout this border with all kinds of different conditions. Putin asked me in the meeting, what should I do in a particular area where we have people surrounded and they don't want to give up? Do I kill them? How do I get them to give up? I'm happy not to kill everybody. I'm happy to get people to wave the white flag if I can get them to wave the white flag. And that one situation, Steve, this is Putin talking to me, is just one example of 70, 80, 90 different situations out there along this border, each one having different battlefield conditions, each one needing a separate conversation. That's what has to happen for a ceasefire, and yet we're talking about it. That's a big, big deal. Our technical teams are going to be meeting in Jeddah beginning Monday. That's a big deal. There's all kinds of good, positive talk coming out of Russia about their willingness to consider all of these different things. And Zelensky had a wonderful conversation with the president after the President Putin's conversation the next day. And I think that indicates that they've got some degree of flexibility in the way that they've been thinking about finishing up this conflict. So I am, not to sound like a forever optimist, but I am very, very optimistic that we're going to be able to bring the two sides together. We have narrowed the issues so considerably.
And in that interview, Steve Witkoff basically showed himself as unprofessional, brainwashed by Russian propaganda, very much sympathetic to Russia. And of course, he also showed how incompetent he is. And one of the reasons why he ended up being on this team, not Keith Kellogg, even though he's still quite sympathetic to Russia, Russia asked for him to not be on the team because they said he is way too sympathetic to Ukraine. But the reality of the matter is that Keith Kellogg has like decades of military experience and understands negotiation, understands tactics, and would be a much harder nut to crack than Witkoff is. Witkoff is a real estate agent. He worked in real estate in New York, as far as I understand, for most of his career, and he is not a world-class negotiator for politics and conflict resolution. He's easy, and in this interview, it was very, very evident how sympathetic to Russia he is and why Russia would rather deal with him than someone else, because they can sway him. They can easily sway him. So let's discuss some of the statements that Putin's mouth basically said through Witkoff in that Tucker Carlson interview. Let's start with this simple fact. Witkoff could not point to the front line on the map. In fact, he called the line of contact, which is the front line, the border between Russia and Ukraine, essentially saying that the contested, temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine are Russia, and that the warfare is being done on the border between Russia and Ukraine. That's the border between Ukraine and temporarily occupied Ukraine. There is no border, there is a line of contact or a line of fire. He also said he also had no idea which regions of Ukraine were contested. He said something along the lines of Donbass and Crimea. Those are not the regions. And Crimea, while it is one of the contested regions, that's referring to 2014, not 2022. The four contested regions or temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine are Zaporizhia, Kherson, Donetsk, and Luhansk. And Russia doesn't even hold all of those. They hold parts of those regions, not the entirety of the regions. Russia right now occupies 20% of Ukraine. 20%. That's the size of some countries, because Ukraine is the size of Texas. And going into the negotiations for territorial concessions, not even knowing what the territories are called, where they're located, what they are, or when they were invaded, I mean, at least irresponsible. He then went on to spew Russian propaganda as such, saying that there were referendums where 80 to 90% of people in these contested regions voted to be governed by Russia. Those referendums were done without the UN. They were done without international observers, independent observers. They were done under pressure from Russian soldiers who were armed. There are tons of pictures illustrating how these referendums were done. They were done not in safe conditions, and they were conducted when Ukrainians were already under occupation and under lots of torture, threats, and threat to their life from Russian soldiers that were present while these people casted their votes. So yeah, that's simply Russian propaganda. He then went on to say that Russia returned these 5 regions and got what it wanted. So first of all, let's talk about the choice of language here. Returned. He's not saying that, Russia invaded these regions. He says that Russia returned them, basically deeming them Russian and legitimizing their invasion. But again, Russia didn't get what it wanted, even if we're talking about its goals currently, because they want the rest of Zaporizhia, they want the rest of Kherson, the rest of Donetsk, the rest of Luhansk. They also want these territories to be internationally acclaimed as Russian. Meanwhile, they're not, and they won't be, because they're a territory of Ukraine, an internationally declared territory of Ukraine. But then again, what are we actually expecting from the negotiator, from the administration that feels like they can call Canada the 51st state and they have claim to Panama and Greenland? In reality, if you look at this negotiation, no matter which side you support, Trump feels like he's entitled to Canada. He uses the same rhetoric to talk about Canada as Russia used to talk about Ukraine. He thinks he's entitled to Greenland, and he thinks he's entitled to Panama. So do you really think someone from his administration is going to be negotiating peace on unbiased and just terms? No, they're not, because in reality, they think the same way as Russia does. And that's incredibly unfortunate. The next brilliant bit that we heard in his interview was that Ukraine in NATO is like Hamas on the border with Israel. That is an incredibly terrible thing to say. Hamas is a terrorist organization, no matter what their motives are, and I'm not taking sides here. I'm not saying who's right or who's wrong. I don't condone the actions of Israel, but Hamas is in fact a terrorist organization. Ukraine is not an organization. Ukraine is a country. Ukraine has never committed acts of terrorism against Russia. Ukraine never invaded Russia. Ukraine never did anything wrong to Russia. NATO is a defensive alliance, and Ukraine wants to be in NATO because Russia invaded Ukraine. Ukraine never broke into Russia and massacred civilians. Ukraine never committed any acts of terrorism against Russia. And this particular bit is a Kremlin mouthpiece, and he's using quite literally the Kremlin language to talk about this situation. He then also said that Zelensky and Yermak agreed that Ukraine is not going to be in NATO. Actually, that's not true, because on March 24th, Zelensky said that the ultimate goal for Ukraine is NATO, and there have never been any official statements about Ukraine declining to be part of NATO or no longer pursuing this cause. And of course, there are negotiations for alternative guarantees that aren't NATO, but what Witkoff said is just his own assumption based in nothing. And interestingly, why would Putin care about Ukraine being in NATO? Again, NATO is a defense alliance. NATO never attacked Russia. NATO never made any threats to Russia. And now that there is such a Russia-friendly administration in the United States, which is the largest, head of NATO, why would he care? If Putin is not planning on attacking Ukraine again, why would he care if Ukraine is in NATO? Giorgia Meloni said it best. She said that, we should give Ukraine Article 5 as a guarantee from NATO, because in that case, if Putin doesn't want to attack, why would he mind? He shouldn't mind, right? The next literally Kremlin talking point is Witkoff talking about how Zelensky is going to be defeated because Russia is a nuclear power with a larger population. Right, sure. So Russia has 144 million people and Ukraine has 41 million people. Obviously, a lot of the people have been killed by Russia. And then Ukraine doesn't have nuclear weapons because we gave them up trillions of dollars of nuclear weapons in 1994 in exchange for territorial protections from Russia, France, the UK, and the United States. However, if Russia is this big nuclear power, they can wipe us off the planet Earth and they have so much more population and we are destined to lose. How come is it that Russia is fighting for almost 4 years now and is still not winning? This whole rhetoric that Ukraine is losing and Russia is winning is such a stupid, genuinely rhetoric, because in no way and absolutely in no world is for Russia, that claims to be second best military in the world, there is no world in which it would take them 3.5 years and they would have less gains than any failed conflict in history. If you look at what Russia holds today, they hold less than on the day of the initial full-scale invasion in 2022. Russia lost territory. Ukraine also managed to break through into Russia. There was recently a drone strike on Moscow. Have we seen anything that Russia pushed back? No, they just continue killing Ukrainian civilians, which is something they have been doing for 3.5 years anyway. Ukraine almost annihilated Russia's entire fleet, their pride and joy. How is that winning? The rhetoric of Russia winning literally comes from Russia, and anyone who repeats it is a Kremlin's mouthpiece. The next fantastic talking point is that Putin gave Trump. Another fantastic point is that Putin gave Trump a hand in peace, right? And this one is kind of funny because Witkoff is basically saying that Putin is offering cooperation on peace to Trump, and he's really trying and he wants peace. Yeah, that's really evident based on the fact that from the day that they agreed on the peace deal, Russia literally attacked Ukrainian energy infrastructure 40 minutes later. Drone strikes have been relentless and a lot more frequent than they were before. They go much harder, and Putin is aiming to have as many human casualties as possible. And that all happened after they have agreed on this so-called halt on energy infrastructure strikes. And then also there is no public evidence of this deal taking place or of Putin offering anything. Russia is not offering any peace. Russia is putting forth ultimatums, and the US is really not challenging it back because, as we can see in this interview itself, Witkoff is like swooning over Putin and over Russia. So when you do, if you need any evidence of that, Witkoff was basically swooning and talking about how Putin is so fantastic, and he's so respectful to Trump, and he's so great. And you've seen in contrast how Zelensky was acting in the Oval Office, basically setting this baseline that Russia is so easy and sweet to deal with, and Ukraine is so difficult. Yeah, of course, Russia is the aggressor that literally knows it has this administration wrapped around its finger, and all of these special envoys and politicians basically kissing Putin's feet. But I digress. He also then said that Putin is such a sweet individual because after there was an attempt on Trump's life, Putin gave him a portrait and he was praying for Trump. First of all, there is zero evidence of this portrait. I mean, it might have been true, but also, what does that have to do with anything? I mean, Zelensky also called Trump and he also made a statement and said that it was awful that there was this situation. Russian propagandists were literally cheering on the attempt on Trump's life. So it just kind of doesn't make any sense other than to try and justify their actions that are so easy and so favorable of Russia. Then he also went on to say that Ukrainian military is surrounded in Kursk, but Putin, the sweet, sweet Putin, the one with a big heart and so much empathy, he doesn't want to kill them. And he, in fact, asked Witkoff directly, he's like, we have this situation, we have these military men surrounded, and I don't want to kill them. What do I do? So there is actually absolutely no confirmation of Ukrainian military being surrounded in Kursk. There are still battles that are ongoing. And, while they're trying to create this narrative that Ukraine actually lost Kursk and Russia is being this empathetic power that is letting them surrender, Ukraine took Belgrade, the weak Ukraine that is losing to Russia. Ukraine literally took parts of Belgrade instead. Yeah, we're totally so surrounded. And the reason why Ukraine was leaving Kursk is not because Russia took it back or surrounded us. It's because it was not giving us any strategic value anymore. And there was no point of people fighting there and dying in order to hold a territory that holds no strategic goal. There was no point in holding our military there and, continue warfare and let people die for a territory that holds absolutely no strategic goal for us at all at this point. So yeah, also last time there was a Russian orchestrated surrender where they were going to let Ukrainians leave, was Ilovaisk, where Ukrainians were actually surrounded, and Russia agreed to a green corridor and then literally purposely killed 300 surrendering Ukrainian military personnel, 300 plus. And it was one of the biggest tragedies in Ukraine in 2014, from the 2014 invasion. And Russia specifically agreed to a green corridor and then specifically targeted the military that was leaving and has surrendered. So yeah, no, Russia's not empathetic. Then my favorite bit of this entire conversation, I think, is that Witkoff said that Americans had to suffer or had to endure censorship, and they didn't hear Russia's side of the story. Russia invaded a sovereign country. Whether you agree with Russia, you like Russia, I mean, obviously Witkoff agrees with Russia because he's in Trump's administration and he thinks that he has claim to Canada and Greenland and Panama, right? It's the same sort of thinking. But the point is, whether you agree or you disagree, Ukraine had internationally recognized borders. Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014. Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. Russia messed with the Ukrainian election in 2004 during Orange Revolution because the CIA actually recently released files that Russia was trying to kill the Ukrainian candidate that was winning the election in order to install their own candidate, Yanukovych, which they later succeeded to do. So yeah, there is really no censorship. And yes, RT and Sputnik have been censored and have been forbidden on TV in most reasonable countries because they are a propaganda machine that tells lies, and I mean information that can be fact-checked as factually incorrect. And they use it specifically to push their narrative, the one that Witkoff is pushing in this scenario. But they're still available on YouTube, on X, but they're still available on platforms like X. So it's not like Americans suffered from not hearing Russia's side. Yeah, Russia has bot farms for days, and a lot of people actually hear Russia's side and Russia's lies and Russian propaganda because it's overwhelmingly everywhere on the internet. So yeah, I wouldn't be, saying that Americans had to endure censorship. Americans actually have to endure Russian lies every single time they open a web browser. Yeah, the next lovely point is that Russia doesn't want to absorb Ukraine or Europe at all. And they're just happy with the 5 regions, those same regions that Witkoff doesn't know the names to or where they are or what they are. But, Putin has been talking about the historical unity of Ukraine and Russia and all of his broader goals. He consistently has his propagandists talk about Finland and Sweden and Latvia and Lithuania and Poland and, I don't know, the UK sometimes being Russian lands and how they should nuke London or nuke Paris or all of these things. So really, that's not true. And if Russia were to absorb or swallow Ukraine, they would be going further. And they're not making any secret out of it. You can watch literally any of the Russian propagandists on X telling you exactly that, because that is his goal. Then Witkoff did say that there is going to be an election in Ukraine, and Zelensky is not going to survive politically. This narrative that Zelensky has no support because Trump said something along the lines of Zelensky having 5% support, which is laughable. Actually, once Trump said that his support has grown, and now it's at almost about 70% again. Yeah, we might not like some of his policies, but we as Ukrainians do not want to change our president because this is the person that actually stands up for us against people like Trump and their forcible, unjust peace, which is not really peace, which is a surrender to Russia. But anyways, the election in Ukraine cannot happen due to the martial law, and this martial law started in 2022. When we can have the election is dependent on when the war is actually going to end, and we mean justly. Not Russia saying, oh yeah, sure, we agreed with America to have a ceasefire on the power grid infrastructure, and then literally striking 40 minutes later, and then the US acting like that never happened. There is no confirmation of any such election taking place anytime soon. And moreover, his rating, again, his favorability rating is over 60%, reaching 70 now. So saying that he would be politically annihilated in an election is kind of ridiculous. And last but not least, of course, the US and Russia can do good things together, said Witkoff. He was talking about economic, energetic, and AI cooperation between Russia and the United States, and that is just abominable. Because imagine him saying, oh yeah, I mean, the United States and Nazi Germany can do fantastic things together. Hitler is so sweet. When there was an attempt on the American president, he gave him a portrait and he was praying for him. That's basically what's happening today. But the more we look at the administration in America, the more similarities with the Russian dictatorship there are. And the way that they talk about other countries, their entitlement to land, their entitlement to other people, how they talk about Canadians being nothing but basically Americans, but just, north of the border, we can see that it's not uncanny that they favor each other so much and are so fond of each other. But theoretically, the US and Russia can have cooperation, but there are all of these sanctions on Russia since 2014 that have been strengthened in 2022. And the war in Ukraine is obviously complicating this. While Russia is conducting the war in Ukraine, it would be incredibly, incredibly dubious to weaken those sanctions and to cooperate with Russia, because Russia is an aggressor and Russia has been recognized as a terrorist state. There is an international criminal court arrest warrant for Putin. There is a case in The Hague for his crimes against humanity and war crimes. And you really are going to sit there and talk about Russia's side and good, sweet, empathetic Russia that just wants its land back, a land that doesn't belong to it, a land that Putin has said multiple times before 2014 belongs to Ukraine and there are no territorial disputes? That, to me, is abominable. What Witkoff has been saying the entire time in this interview is just straight up Russian talking points coming through America's politician's mouth. I mean, America's former real estate agent who's unqualified to lead these negotiations, but that's exactly why Putin likes him where he is. They are not based in fact. They're based in his trust and fondness in and of Putin. And they're actually directly opposite to fact, based on America's own intelligence services and their own fact-checking or any independent sources. So also a lot of the statements that he made are yet to be confirmed because there has been no confirmation or no evidence of such. So basically this entire conversation of Witkoff and Tucker Carlson was orchestrated in order to help Russia and in order to help the Russian narrative. And funny when he says that, Americans have not heard the Russian side because, well, Joe Rogan and Lex Friedman and Tucker Carlson have been working tirelessly for the past 3 years, bringing Russia's side and Russia's lies and Russian propaganda to light. Jackson Hinkle and other paid actors who were spewing Russian disinformation on social media and brainwashing Americans more effectively than RT or Sputnik ever could. So yeah, this entire conversation was just a sea of Kremlin's lies and one man who is either paid or a useful idiot who fell for them. And that's all I have for you for today. Please do let me know if you agree with my assessment and what shocked you the most out of Witkoff's statements. Do you think he's qualified to lead this negotiation? And generally, what are your thoughts and suggestions and questions? I would love to answer them in the next episode. In the meanwhile, please do like this video and send it to a friend or really anyone and everyone. And of course, subscribe to our channel and don't forget to turn on your notifications so you don't miss when the next episode comes out. See ya.